In this video, we'll be talking about the life at home in the United States and the military tactics during the Vietnam War.
The U.S. first became involved in Vietnam when they sent $15 million to the French to aid in fighting. The reason the U.S. got involved in the early 50s was fear of communism takeover. This theory is called the domino effect, where other surrounding countries would fall under communist power.
Because of a national fear of communism, initially the public was in favor of supporting and fighting the North Vietnamese in the Vietnam War. As support began to diminish, a change in culture was inevitable.
With many drafted soldiers not returning from home and a non-noticeable difference in Vietnam, many of the United States youth felt that their friends were dying for a lost cause. Many musicians shared this opinion on the war, and their ideas are evident in their music. Musicians like Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, the Rolling Stones, Jefferson Airplane, and many others.
This is seen as the most rapid change in musical styles in the world history, as many of the most talented artists were born from new genres of music that the world had never seen before. Some of the most iconic songs that were a direct response to the Vietnamese conflicts include Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival, Gimme Shelter by the Rolling Stones, War by Edwin Starr, Revolution by the Beatles, and many others.
The youth's response started out peaceful, but gradually became more and more violent. Many events, like the Kent State shooting, displayed that young U.S. citizens did not want a war. This is a speech by former President Nixon in response to the shootings.
In the light of the Kent State University incident, could you tell us what, in your judgment, is the proper action and conduct for a police force or a National Guard force when ordered to clear a campus area and faced with a crowd throwing rocks?
We think we've done a rather good job here in Washington in that respect. As you note, we handled the two demonstrations, October 15th and November 15th of last year, without any significant casualties. And that took a lot of doing because there were some pretty rough people involved. A few were rough. Most of them were very peaceful. I would hope that the experience that we have had in that respect could be shared by the National Guards, which of course are not under federal control, but under state control. Now, what I say is not to be interpreted as a criticism in advance of my getting the facts of the National Guards at Kent State. I want to know what the facts are. I've asked for the facts, and when I get them, I'll have something to say about it. But I do know that when you do have a situation of a crowd throwing rocks, and the National Guard is called in, that there is always the chance that it will escalate into the kind of a tragedy that happened at Kent State. And if there's one thing I am personally committed to, it's this. I saw the pictures of those four youngsters in the Evening Star the day after that tragedy. And I vowed then that we were going to find methods that would be more effective to deal with these problems of violence, methods that would deal with those who would use force and violence and endanger others, but at the same time would not take the lives of innocent people.
We interviewed a member of the public who was alive during this time period. We asked him how he felt during the beginning, and he responded claiming that since he was part of the military and had a strong dislike towards communism, he was in full support of the war. We asked how America felt as the war progressed, and he responded saying that they slowly opposed the fighting, and it was clear that the United States became more volatile towards fighting in general. We asked how it was domestically towards the end of the war, and he responded saying that soldiers were treated with disrespect because they were reported to have been killing innocent Vietnamese people, including children, regardless of all the trauma they had experienced during the fighting. Moving away from the citizens' opinion of the United States, let's move towards the actual fighting itself.
Unlike any other war, the fighting style consisted primarily of guerrilla warfare. In many cases, there is a distance between many of the attacks, and they occurred at random times. Fighting for the hills to push the NVA line backwards caused the most amount of American casualties. Since the Vietnamese people were fighting on their homeland, they had a large advantage by knowing the land. It was difficult to find them before they found the U.S. soldiers.
The fighting conditions during the war were terrible, as the U.S. soldiers were fighting in a rainforest that was almost alien to them. A large percentage of the time it was raining, causing it to be uncomfortable and almost impossible to stay dry, causing many different infections and diseases. It was difficult to move around through thick jungle, as many of the U.S. troops were used to a completely different terrain and lacked experience in this specific landscape. Because they were fighting on their homeland, the Vietnamese people and Vietnamese army were able to build tunnels because they knew the landscape, they knew where to build them, and where the enemy would attack from. It is always easier to play the defense, especially on a very foreign landscape for the Americans. When word of the Americans approached the villages, they were able to evacuate the villages before the Americans came. Some villages, however, did not evacuate in time, and the Americans came through. A lot of the villagers were killed because it was very difficult for the American soldiers to identify who was a Viet Cong. Take into consideration the amount of fear that many of the Americans had as they were going through the villages, a lot of unnecessary deaths were caused. Word of this kind of stuff reaching the United States homeland caused many of the U.S. citizens to be very upset. To the people at home, they felt that the American soldiers were just killing at will, and not taking into consideration who the Americans were actually killing. This is what sparked many of the riots and protests at home. Some of the weapons used by the Americans include the M60 machine gun, which was used in helicopters, the Stoner 63 machine gun, the M79 grenade launcher, M2 and M9 flamethrowers, the M16 rifle, the Cobra attack helicopter, and the UH-1 Iroquois, also known as the Huey, which is the most common helicopter. The North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong had many weapons, which include the AK-47, the AKM rifle, the Mosin Nagant, the PPSH-41, and the Type 99 light machine gun. One of the major advantages that the Americans had was their superior air support. The American air support was able to drop bombs and napalm onto the enemy locations. The main targets of the American air support were Hanoi and Haiphong. Between 1965 and 1968, over 1,400 U.S. airplanes were shot down over North Vietnam. Many Vietnamese people claim that the bombings were ineffective in deteriorating the morale of the Vietnamese people during this time. With over 260 million bombs dropped, it would seem that the war would be in the Americans' favor.
One influential product that was popular during this time was drugs. This was popular both at home and on the battlefield. Drugs like marijuana were used on the battlefield because in Vietnam it grows in many places around the jungle. This in many cases led to foolish mistakes and sometimes injuries or death. The drug used at home was even worse. People experimented with hallucinogenic drugs while protesting to escape from the real world.
Much of the drug use was contributed to coping with the harsh realities of war. Soldiers were allowed to use these drugs because it prevented them from going insane.
Although looked upon poorly, the Vietnam War wasn't a complete failure. We were able to contain communism in North Vietnam, and after the war was over, the communist North Vietnam eventually became a republic, even with the Americans losing. Without our involvement, there's a strong chance that communism would have spread. With this victory, however, the negatives outweigh the positives and is looked upon as a failure. In total, there were over 58,000 deaths and over 150,000 wounded. With the nation's youth making pushes and disagreeing with the government's every movement the government made, it was questioned. The idea of questioning the government is still in effect today. This is especially true after the public was lied to about the bombings in Cambodia. The only difference is that the environment is not as hostile as it was during this time.
After the Americans left Vietnam, the country was in much worse shape than it had been. The infrastructure was destroyed, thousands of people have been killed, and chemicals were destroying the environment within the country. South Vietnamese armies were massacred by the North Vietnamese, and it still remains one of the poorest countries in the world. This military failure had the world questioning the most powerful nation in the world. The whole war as a whole seems to have been not worth it. The upwards of 2 million casualties caused within the duration of the war seem to have been for a war that was not worth fighting over. Would communism have spread throughout the country? It may have. Would communism have spread throughout the world? Probably not.